building was flush up against the maple hollow, literally next to the oldest trees. On that horizon, one sees the Thompsons moved in, a vestige of long desertion. For others, there was always the feeling that something bad had happened in this big house. A whole family disappeared, and the sound of children crying still faintly lingered around it. But for Sarah and John Thompson, it was a different story entirely that might just end up well at last with such an acquisition. For Sarah and John Thompson, it gave a new impetus for their family of four. The Thompsons, fresh to town and bearing a 12-year-old son named Noah with them, threw themselves headlong into life at the rambling old Victorian. Anyway, our family is conservative. After they had cracked the door jamb of an old house and went in, John remarked, shaking the cobwebs aside. You know, every old spot has its own queer things. He had hanged close out of habit at first, but did not feel the embrace of listening stillness now. The stuffed-up feeling in his ears, however, seemed all the more oppressive in comparison with this new calm. At the same time, there was a precision to it that nothing else could have matched, not even this living room tranquility, because moving was one of those life tasks which really took it out of you financially and emotionally. Everywhere were things needing done, many hours too, if not days upon days, to get everything working again. This place really is cool, Mom. Noah's voice echoed from upstairs, the sound bouncing out of the empty walls. I'm glad he likes it. Sarah said under her breath to John, who was too busy getting out tools to fix the warped front door. It was not until after this, when they showed her where the basement was. She gazed frowningly at the heavy wood door that appeared behind the kitchen. This door, she said. It's strange. That's just the entrance to the cellar, John replied, putting some effort into opening it. The hinges creaked, and the sound seemed to reverberate throughout the kitchen like a warning. Then the narrow staircase in front of them disappeared into blackness. The air from below was cold and wet, a slight metallic smell in its taste. Noah was next to him on Sarah's right, peering down. The only bright spot in his eyes was curiosity. Can I go down there and have a look? He pleaded. No, not until your dad gets the lights up and running, Sarah said through tight lips. Her grip tightened on Rob's shoulder. John laughed. You act as if there's a monster downstairs. Sarah said nothing, but the anticipation gnawed at her. There was something about the basement that just wrong. Scratches in the night. The first few nights passed without incident, however. Beside an array of silent electronic gadgets in an old house, the family established their own pattern and clung to that existence, just like everyone else on Earth. John tried to replace the bulb, but claimed it needed completely rewired. He'd blunder on his wiring and be paying too much for new parts. I promised. This weekend. Up until then, the basement was kept in darkness and the door firmly closed. At the first sound of the noise, it was the fourth night Sarah heard. She lay in bed, listening to her husband's even puttering breathing next to her, and heard a scratchy sound float up through floorboards. Her breathing stuck in her throat, and she held perfectly still. It was faint, hardly audible and unmistakable. Scratch. 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 She poked at John. Can you hear that? She whispered. He moaned in his sleep. It's an old house. Probably the pipes. So it was that the next morning Sarah tried to persuade herself she had dreamt it, but when she entered the kitchen, she found Noah standing beside the basement door. His head was cocked, listening. What are you doing? Sarah asked. Her voice was sharper than she had intended. Caught unawares, Noah flushed. Something like that. Sarah's pulse bounded. Like what? He shrugged. No idea. It could have been rats, I suppose. She gave him a smile that tested her skills of repudiation. It's probably just mice. Don't worry about it. But Noah was now curious. That night, while Sarah was busy ironing and John tinkered with the damp tap in the bathroom, Noah stole down into the basement. As he descended the creaking steps, his beam cut through the blackness. The air grew colder with every step, and the odor of methane became increasingly strong. The flashlight's beam flickered, and the shadows cast on the stone walls shifted. At the bottom of the stairs, Noah discovered a dirt floor in which debris had accumulated. Rusted tools hung on the walls, and an old wooden chest sat in the corner. Its dirty surface bore not a single nick of wear, but the far wall caught his attention. striations ranging from shallow to jagged and deep, as if they had been gouged into the stone by claws. Parallel lines etched into rock. "Now," he whispered, stepping closer. "Inch." He reached out a hand and touched the grooves. Although cold, they felt nicer, somehow alive. His heart racing, Charlie swallowed hard. The shadows looked as though they were moving, dodging the light just beyond its grasp. Suddenly, the cellar felt claustrophobic. He fled up the stairs, clutching the torch, and slammed the door behind him. But it wasn't pipes. Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling above her as the scraping continued, slow and purposeful. Noah didn't tell his parents what he had seen. He attempted to reassure himself that it was in his mind, the result of a frightening basement and too many late-night horror films. But in that evening, the scratching returned again, and louder at that, together with a faint whispering below the floorboards. Sarah also heard this. She sat up in bed listening. When there was only a barely perceptible echo of whispers, she sat down quickly, and her damp hair sprang off her shoulders as though disappointed they had not whispered in her ear all along. Beside her, John snored away its comforting obliviousness. She slipped out of bed and went to Noah's room on cold, marvelous feet. He was already awake and just sitting bent over with his knees apart in the bed, clutching a small flashlight to his chest. Now Tvsvenelis Nernaya 1 miagosendapdot grop. Arriving at the edge of a sad little whistling flame, one of them is in the water. Can you hear its voice? It went on in her heart as she lay in bed, and although she could not say why, she felt cold all over, her skin pricked with little shivers. By the time his next loud snore rose from the pit of his stomach beside her, a half hour had passed. She got out of bed and crept to Noah's room. He was sitting on the bed, his knees drawn up and his hands white around a torch. "You hear it too, don't you?" he asked, his voice shaking. Sarah nodded. "Stay here." But her own voice trembled. With a torch in her hand, Sarah made her way to the kitchen. The basement door was large and its edges were visible in the dim moonlight. You could hear the noise as it came closer. A babble of whispers, all of them crying out to her. With trembling fingers, she turned the doorknob. She took a deep breath as she opened the door. The whispers stopped. Sarah looked into the pitch-black darkness, the flashlight beams slicing but showing nothing amiss. She steeled herself and stepped down the stairs, careful not to make a sound. The air felt colder than she had expected, biting at her skin at the bottom. Her breath came out in visible plumes within the humid air as she swept the flashlight around the room. It appeared that everything was in its rightful place. However, that awful feeling still remained. When she was walking back up the stairs, the little light on her flashlight spotted something across the far wall. The scratches. Cautiously, she walked up to them, her stomach twisting as she ran her finger along the deep ridges. They were much too perfect and purposeful to be natural. She jolted at a sound behind her. She spun around, flashlight quivering in hand. From the shadows there came a low, throaty growl. Two glowing eyes broke free from the shadows, locking onto her each sharp breath and hitched. The torchlight flickered, then died.